Welcome everyone. My name is Sophia, and I'm a junior consultant at Turner and Townsend. We're joined today by Emma from Turner and Townsend as well. She's a principal consultant now. Um, the purpose of the event, this is a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is a fully funded by the Department of Energy, Security and Net Zero, delivered by Turner and Townsend.
Thank you, Sophia. Yes, so my name is Emma Woods, Principal Consultant at Turner and Townsend, and today's masterclass is all about integrating monitoring and evaluation. So what we'll cover is talking about what the basic statutory requirements are for monitoring and evaluation. And when we talk about this, we're going to be making reference to PAS 2035, what your organizational demands are when it comes to collecting any information you need, measuring intended outcomes, what basic monitoring and evaluation looks like, and what recommendations we can provide for developing a questionnaire to help you with your monitoring and evaluation. So hopefully there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end as well. So please do pop any questions in the chat as we go along, or can pick them up at the end as well. So starting off with basic statutory requirements, I'm just going to warn you now, we will talk about PAS 2035. There'll be aspects of it that we'll talk about. And if you aren't familiar about what PAS 2035 is or the different standards and requirements within it, I would recommend signing on for our PAS 2035 masterclasses, because that will go into a bit more detail. In terms of the basic statutory requirements, these requirements are the ones that are outlined, as mentioned, in PAS 2035. And as it says on the screen, really the intention is to create a feedback loop for those retrofit coordinators, as well as Trustmark and other organisation, on what's working and what isn't when it comes to your retrofit project. So as it says there on screen, the retrofit coordinator has to ensure that every retrofit project is subject to some kind of monitoring and evaluation. And we'll talk a bit about that, but there is a basic level that they need to achieve, and then there may be other additional requirements afterwards. And they have to be able to understand what the intended outcomes for that retrofit project is, and identify and learn from any of the project-specific or systematic problems following a retrofit risk assessment, the dwelling assessment, the retrofit design, the installation of the energy efficiency measures themselves, or the testing of it, and the commissioning and handing over of those energy efficiency measures. So what we want is really to demonstrate that the projects are being delivered correctly, and secondly, to identify things that might be going wrong and how we go about rectifying them. So the overall aim of kind of the monitoring evaluation is to ensure the projects are being delivered and achieving those intended outcomes. And we'll talk a little bit about what those intended outcomes are and what they look like in the presentation. So as mentioned, this is an extract from the PAS 2035 standard, and there are different levels of monitoring and evaluation that are applied for PAS 2035. All projects, irrespective of the level, will have to complete the basic monitoring and evaluation. And for example, if a project is looking to install something like loft insulation, which falls under a risk pathway A under PAS 2035, they will still have to complete a basic monitoring to check it's achieved its intended outcomes. So this will focus on the resident feedback itself. So things like, have they saved money, or are their homes generally warmer? So every project will undergo some kind of basic monitoring and evaluation, but then there are escalating levels of monitoring that's required based on the different risk pathways. So the next level of the kind of monitoring and evaluation is the intermediate level. And this basically looks at, following that basic monitoring, has there been anything raised from that you need to then do further kind of checks on? So as it says there on screen, intermediate monitoring evaluation should be applied to projects for which, in the opinion of the client or the retrofit coordinator or evaluator, basic monitoring and evaluation indicates that outcomes are significantly different to those originally agreed and intended, or there are also unintended consequences for the retrofit work. So for example, you might have installed something like cavity wall insulation to the property, and following surveys or other monitoring that you've done, actually you found that there's still damp and mold occurrences happening. So that's an unintended consequence of carrying out the cavity wall installation. And then it's then to understand why that has happened. Is it incorrect installation practices? What has gone wrong during that process? It's also worth noting in some cases, occupants who experience fuel poverty. So, as part of the monitoring evaluation, you might collect information about whether they've saved money from the energy efficiency installations. But if those that experience fuel poverty prior to the retrofit were unable to heat their homes adequately, they might take benefits of retrofit in increased comfort rather than monetary savings. So this needs to also be considered in the monitoring and evaluation processes. And I think this is important because not one occupant will be the same, and how you collect that information and how you measure those intended outcomes may be different. So it's worth, or it's not necessarily different, but the results of those intended outcomes might be different. So it's really important to make sure that you're collecting the right information when it comes to the occupancy surveys. So moving on to organizational monitoring and evaluation. So we've decided to include this in here because as an organization, you might have ideas for what can tag alongside some of the retrofit works and retrofit surveys that are needed. So as an organization, you don't just carry out retrofit work. There are other things that you might need to measure and consider. So for example, if you are a resident focused team, as part of the kind of measuring that you're doing, one of the things you want to look at is tenant satisfaction. So when you're carrying out some of the monitoring and evaluation under your retrofit works, that might also be a consideration of things you want to collate from the resident. The other is general welfare checks as well as a resident focused team. And then also within your assets team. So there may be things like damp and mold when you're carrying out the initial survey. If there are damp and mold during those initial retrofit assessments, then it's worth taking note of those. The stock condition surveys. So if you're carrying out your retrofit assessments and actually you're thinking about installing external wall insulation, you might also be looking at the condition of the windows at the same time because they're going to have to be refitted as part of the PAS 2035 requirements. So are the conditions of the windows good and suitable for PAS 2035? Have they got the right vents? All of these things that you might have to consider that may get also picked up within your stock condition survey. You've also got the HHSRS, so the Housing Health Safety Rating System. So it does measure similar things from your stock condition survey about the different components and the condition of those components of the home, but there are also basic things like hazards within the home. So it could be as simple as the stair railings. Are there any kind of railings going up the stairs for someone to be able to hold on to? So when you're undergoing retrofit surveys, someone's already going to be there present at the home. Are these things that you can also carry out to start collating some of that information? And then lastly is that pound per sat point. So this is more related to when you carry out the retrofit assessment or design of the property. You might want to understand what is that payback of installing those energy efficiency measures. How much do I have to spend to get a certain number of sat point increases to meet EPC band C? Now, you might want to then look at kind of future planning for that. So it's not just achieving EPC band C, but following on from that, how much more will I have to spend to then achieve net zero or other targets that you might be looking to achieve? And this is just a bit of a health warning. So obviously we can talk about collating all this information, carrying out monitoring evaluation practices, but over monitoring and evaluating can also be crushing for the resident. So it might be good, you need to be clear on what you're looking to collate, when you're looking to do it, and why you're collating this information. that way you're not wasting the customer's time. You're not, as it says there on screen, you're not asking them questions where you're not prepared to act on what you're talking about. So it's really important, try to keep things as simple as possible for the resident and the occupant, and making sure you're not overdoing it. It'd be good now to start thinking about the intended outcomes. What kinds of things, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, do we need to be measuring in terms of those intended outcomes? So these are examples of the things that should be measured, or some of the examples that you might look to be measured. But the most important thing is it does have to be measurable. So you have to be able to say something has improved or not improved from it. So these are the kind of split into kind of quantitative and qualitative examples. So if we go through the first one, reduced fuel use. So one of the things we'll want to be able to find out is actually, are they heating their homes for as much as they used to be, or are the homes keeping warmer for longer now that you've installed the energy efficiency measures? So are there reduced need for heating? And following that, can you actually see lower fuel bills as a result of that? Now, that might not always be the case, is because you could find actually changing heating systems from, let's say, a gas boiler to an air source heat pump, you might find actually it's more expensive for some reason, from switching from gas to electricity, for example. So understanding what those intended outcomes are and have they been achieved. If they haven't, then working out potentially what might have gone wrong. Reduced summertime overheating. So another thing that you might want to measure during kind of carrying out the retrofit projects is something that's overlooked when retrofitting, is actually the overheating risks. So you can insulate the property really well, but actually, is the ventilation for the property adequate? Are they finding that actually when it comes to summer, it's actually more, it's much warmer, and they're finding that overheating is really bad? And if so, could that be a risk or an intended outcome from not having the right ventilation strategy? Alleviating mold and condensation issues. So, you might have found actually through the initial risk assessments that there was mold present and there were condensation issues that were present. So following on from that, have those improved? Are the occupants finding that there's less mold in the property, or there's less condensation that's happening? And if not, again, could you go back to the issue of things like the ventilation not being adequate? Or you might find actually it might be the resident is blocking up some of the vents because they're finding cold air is coming through it, which again causing issues for ventilation. Or you might find that the occupants are still drying their clothes indoors, which is still causing mold and condensation problems. So this is why it's really useful to kind of collate as much of that data as possible, so you can understand where those if it hasn't met those intended outcomes, what are the reasons for that? Is it because of the way the project has been delivered, or is it something that has happened with differently within the occupant's home? And that last one there as well is similar. So improving indoor air quality. Have they found that actually it's the living in the property is nicer, the actual quality of the air is better because you get, the property is being better ventilated? If we look at the qualitative side of things, the other things you might want to measure in terms of intended outcomes, actually, is it more comfortable to live in? Are they generally warmer, and find that they're not having to wear 3, 4 different layers of clothes just to be in their property? Are they finding that they're having a better quality of life and improved well-being, not having to panic or think about the heating? And then also, are they finding that they're actually making a saving and they're having to spend less on their heating bills? So it's really important to seek feedback from the different residents or occupants, and it's really key to understanding whether the aims have actually been achieved that you initially started out with. There are also other outcomes which are measurable in terms of retrofit project, so things like improving the SAP score. But the resident might not be aware of these things, and it might not be something that they could easily talk about. So the outcomes listed above here are really for those which the feedback can be gathered from actually the resident themselves. They can actually offer an opinion or provide evidence that these outcomes have been achieved for them. The other thing to be aware of, as mentioned, is the changes within a household itself. So, as I mentioned, you might be finding that the residents drying clothes indoors a lot more, or they may have had a child. So there's an increased number of people that are living within the homes, and some of these things will also affect some of those measurable outcomes that you're looking to achieve. So it's really good to start collating as much of this as possible. So going back to the basic monitoring evaluation, so at the start of this presentation, we talked about the basic statutory requirements when it comes to PAS 2035. And in here, we're going to be talking about what the actual basic requirements look like under PAS 2035 when it comes to M&E. So basic monitoring should include the use of a measures specific questionnaire distributed to the client and the occupants, if different, of the retrofitted dwellings to establish, as far as possible, firstly, whether the agreed intended outcomes have been achieved. So we've given a few examples of what some of those intended outcomes are. Now, in the PAS 2035 document, they've also got a separate table. So that's why it says 6.2, because this is an extract from that, which also describes some of those intended outcomes. They also want to understand if there's been any unintended or unexpected consequences of the work. So again, have they found that actually for some reason there's still damp problems or mold issues that have occurred? Is that because of installations not being correct or not done correctly? Whether the client or the occupant are actually satisfied with the outcomes of the work. Are they happy? Are they finding the home more comfortable? Are they finding that actually the way that the installations have taken place are good? All of these different things, the actual satisfaction. The identification of specific points of dissatisfaction. So, following the one above, are there any things that actually they're finding is not great? So, are they finding actually switching from their air source heat pump, they're finding the controls really difficult to use, or something that they might not find as easy? There are other things. So, actually, this one looks at the whole process from the assessment stage through to the design stage, the installation, the testing, and then the commissioning and handover of the measures. So, actually collecting information about how they found the whole process from start to finish, and getting some feedback on that and what could have been improved during those different parts of the process. Identification of elements of the installation that are not working as expected. So actually, they're finding going back to the air source heat pump, for example, it's not heating the home as expected. Is that because of the way the controls or settings have been done, or is it a way of how um, they've used the air source heat pump, or is it because of the fabric measures actually haven't achieved the required heating demand to make it effective? What of those elements are just not working as they kind of expected? And then lastly is any other comments the client might want to make or take away. So this is just a freedom of kind of feedback of understanding the whole process, anything that they want to talk about. And the other thing to mention, the basic monitoring evaluation needs to be completed and reported within 3 months after the handover of that retrofit project. That's again a requirement from the PAS 2035 standard. So here is an example of a monitoring and evaluation plan. You've got the different retrofit objectives that you might want to achieve, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. So here, this example here is qualitative, what the different target metric is, how you're going about doing the measurement of that specific objective, where it is that you're doing it, when and how long for, and who is actually carrying that out. Now, the plan does not include the actual questions for surveys and things that you're doing. It's just a plan of how you're going to execute doing the monitoring and evaluation throughout the process. So the other thing that's not specified under the monitoring requirements, but could be depending on the different pathways you're under, is air tightness test. So again, if your project for some reason is deemed as a risk pathway C, which is one of the highest risks, then there are other requirements where you have to complete an air tightness test. So here's just an example of what that might look like. Air tightness test required. The target metric is the kind of specific metric when it comes to the air tightness testing, how you're going about measuring it, so a blower door test, when and how long for you doing that, and again by whom. So it's a very similar layout, but there may be additional requirements based on the different risk pathways. So there are other things that you might want to include within targets, so things like internal temperatures. So this, again, you might have kind of data loggers or things within the home where you can measure it or measure it kind of there and then. When it comes to monitoring and evaluation plans, ideally, if you have the capability of logging that kind of before you're carrying out any of the energy efficiency works, and so you can actually look at what the improvements look like afterwards. So again, for this internal one, it talks about specific target measures that you want, target temperatures you want to achieve, how you're going about doing it. So installing that data logger, where it is that you've kind of included that data logger, and where in the home you've done it. How long are you keeping it there for? How regularly is that data being collected? And then who is collecting that data and how is that being fed back? So again, sometimes it's not quite as simple. Sometimes you might have to go to the home to collect the data logger, or you might have smart kind of data loggers, which you're able to kind of collect the data there and then. So we're coming towards the end now. Now we're going to start talking a bit about the actual measures itself. So the actual questionnaire itself, where you're looking to collate that data from the monitoring and evaluation process. So this slide outlines best practice for writing different questionnaires to ensure you've got accurate and usable feedback. So one of the things that we recommend is when you're pulling together your questionnaire is have an odd numbered scale on the different questions. And this basically just allows you to be able to have a neutral response, because they might not feel negatively or positively about it. And that in itself is a result. Keeping it simple, non-technical, so that the resident is able to talk about it. And same as keeping it short, simple, and direct. Try not to go up to create the survey so it lasts for a couple of hours. Try not to have really long questions. Try keep it short and simple as possible. Also include a mixture of closed and open questions. So an example of a closed question could be, has the comfort of your home improved? It could just be a yes, no, and then that could be followed by, okay, so why have you found that? Or how is it living in the home following the different works? Whatever that might be, making sure you have got a mixture of closed and open questions. And also include questions that actually the resident can answer confidently. So try not to come up with something like, are you getting the correct efficiency out of your heat pump? They might not know what the efficiency is supposed to be of that heat pump. So actually try and include something like, do you feel that you're benefiting from your new heat pump? So phrasing really does matter. Here is another example of kind of a best practice question you might find when developing a survey. It could be as simple as, how satisfied are you with the internal temperature of your home? So again, very short, very simple, talking about internal temperature of your home, so something that everyone's kind of familiar with. And also this one is a closed question. It's got very options of what you want, but you might want to follow up then with, why have you answered that? Or why were you dissatisfied? And again, an odd number of questions, so it gives you an option for a neutral response if you wanted. When it comes to collating or developing the questionnaires, timing of it really does matter. So residents can't comment on anything, but how the experience of the fitting of the measure if they haven't had an opportunity to use them. So try carry out the survey when thinking about planning your retrofit projects or during the monitoring evaluation. Try choose it during a time where they actually had the opportunity to use the heating or when the installation was actually needed. There's no point in carrying it out during summer where they've not had the chance to use it. So yes, do try and make sure the timing is good. And if you're looking to collate information about PV, then again, making sure that you've tried choosing at a time where there actually has been sunlight to actually see if there has been any benefits. So we're now going to move on to the how. So how do you go about carrying out the monitoring and evaluation? So there are different kind of online survey tools that you can use. You can use paper-based surveys. There are also different things like resident forums or post-retrofit follow-up events. Some of these are kind of set as well with your contractors. Some of them like to do it with the contractors involved or in-depth interviews. So it's really, your residents and how they are best going to respond to kind of information requests. So making sure that you can create kind of situations or tools that are suitable for your different residents. Um, so yeah, anecdotal is as good as well. Case studies of change in the measures has made to a resident is also really important. So if you can try create anecdotal things that have come out of that, that would be really helpful when developing those case studies as well. And so that is it for integrating monitoring and evaluation. So we've covered a little bit about what the basic statutory requirements are when it comes to M&E, what you as an organization might also want to consider when it comes to how to integrate it with the rest of the different types of information you need to collect about your residents. And then we talked a little bit about what intended outcomes are, what they'd look like, and what the basic statutory requirements might be. We've also covered things like the monitoring evaluation plans, examples of what those plans might look like, and how you might pull together the questionnaires you need to start conducting some of those questionnaires yourself. And then any other, I guess, tools that you might need to have on how you collate some of that information as well. So that is the end of this masterclass. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you.